Wrecker Rick from Murphy Diesel isn't just the guy lifting impossible loads and rescuing stranded vehicles in viral videos. On screen, he looks unstoppable, calm under pressure, confident behind the wheel, and unfazed by danger. The massive wreckers, the dramatic recoveries, the satisfied smiles of people saved from hopeless situations all paint a clear picture of success. But off-screen, Rick's story is far more complicated. It's a story shaped by financial risk, physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and choices that could have easily ended everything before it ever began. It's about pushing forward when quitting would have made sense, and questioning whether the cost of persistence was sometimes too high. And that raises an important question right from the start. How many success stories are actually built on moments that almost became total failure? Behind every dramatic recovery and every powerful machine is a journey defined by uncertainty, sacrifice, and a family that carried far more pressure than most viewers ever realize. The early days. Building something from nothing. In 2014, Rick Murphy and his wife Nikki stood at a crossroads. Like many families, they could have chosen safety, steady paychecks, predictable schedules, fewer risks. Instead, they chose uncertainty. They decided to build their own towing and recovery business from scratch, Murphy's Diesel. It wasn't a bold, glamorous launch. There were no investors, no shiny fleet, no safety net. Just belief, stubborn determination, and the willingness to sacrifice comfort for a vision they couldn't fully see yet. The beginning didn't look anything like success. Money was scarce. Equipment was limited. Jobs were inconsistent. Bills didn't wait for good months. There were days when the math simply didn't add up, no matter how carefully Nikki stretched every dollar. For a period of time, they lived inside a toy hauler, not as a lifestyle choice, but as survival. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and far from the image most people associate with business owners. Yet every sacrifice served one purpose: keeping the business alive one more day. Every dollar mattered. Every breakdown felt dangerous. Every slow week felt like a warning. This leads to a difficult question. How far would you personally go to protect a dream before it starts to cost too much? Murphy's Diesel began as a small family operation in northern Arizona, serving remote highways, desert roads, and unpredictable mountain passes. Long nights weren't an exception, they were the norm. Stress was constant, sitting quietly in the background even on good days. Yet Rick and Nikki kept showing up. Even when profits barely existed. Even when doubt crept in during quiet moments. Even when it would have been easier to walk away. Choosing the hardest path. What made Rick stand out early on wasn't fancy branding or expensive trucks. It was the jobs he chose to take. While many towing companies focused on quick, profitable recoveries, Rick answered calls others refused. Remote locations. Dangerous weather. Rollovers on narrow roads where one mistake could turn fatal. Sometimes these jobs paid very little. Sometimes nothing at all. And that created a question many in the industry couldn't understand. Why take work that barely keeps the lights on? Rick believed something most businesses learn too late, that trust compounds faster than money. He saw people at their worst moments, stranded families, exhausted truck drivers, travelers terrified on unfamiliar roads. Instead of contracts and calculations, he offered help. There were times Rick refused payment entirely. Customers cried. Some argued. Others tried to push cash into his hands anyway. When he accepted, he often turned around and used it to help the next person in need. Industry veterans warned him. They called it reckless. Financial suicide. A good way to go broke fast. But Rick wasn't building a brand. He was building a reputation. Social media entered the picture organically, not as marketing, but as documentation. The videos weren't polished ads. They showed real recoveries, real danger, and real people being helped without conditions. Viewers didn't just watch trucks move, they watched compassion in action. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Word spread. Trust grew. When trust becomes opportunity, that trust eventually opened doors no advertisement ever could. Murphy's Diesel began earning contracts with law enforcement agencies to clear major highways, jobs where precision, reliability, and accountability mattered more than speed. This was the turning point. Steady work replaced uncertainty. Growth became possible. The business expanded into 3 locations across northern Arizona. The fleet grew. The pressure of survival eased, at least financially. But the philosophy never changed. Customers weren't transactions. They were people. Which raises another important question. Can a business grow without losing its original values? Or does success always demand compromise? Murphy's Diesel seemed to prove that growth and compassion didn't have to cancel each other out. Yet behind the scenes, a different kind of pressure was building, one success doesn't prepare you for. The risks that almost destroyed everything. Rick's business model challenged traditional rules. He walked away from jobs that felt wrong, even when the money was good. He refused shortcuts that compromised safety. He put people first in an industry where margins are thin and mistakes can be fatal. Competitors didn't always respect that. Some criticized him openly. Others quietly waited for the model to fail. But customers trusted him, and in towing, trust can mean the difference between life and death. Still, there was a hidden cost. The phone never stopped ringing. Emergencies didn't care about rest. Sleep became optional. Rick pushed himself further each season, convinced that being dependable meant being available at all times. One winter storm became the breaking point. For nearly 40 hours straight, Rick worked non-stop, pulling vehicles from snow-choked roads, rescuing strangers from freezing conditions, making split-second decisions while his body screamed for rest. Shortly after, Murphy's Diesel went quiet for almost a month. Officially, it was labeled unfortunate events. Unofficially, it was burnout. This raises a question most people avoid asking. How long can someone keep giving before there's nothing left to give? Rick later admitted that good intentions don't protect the human body or mind. Purpose doesn't cancel exhaustion. Even meaningful work can become destructive when there's no balance. That pause forced something deeper than a business adjustment. It forced a personal reckoning. The family behind the brand. Murphy's Diesel was never just a company. It was a family operation in the truest sense. Rick and Nikki built it side by side. Relatives stepped in to help. Children grew up around diesel engines, flashing lights, and phones ringing at impossible hours. Customers often said the company felt different. Not rushed. Not cold. More human. But success created its own challenges. In towing, emergencies don't respect schedules. Family dinners get interrupted. Holidays get postponed. Birthdays happen over the phone. Plans dissolve when the call comes in. So here's the question no one likes to admit. How do you protect your family when your work never stops? Nikki carried a weight few people saw. While Rick handled danger on the road, she managed fear, finances, and the emotional cost of never knowing when, or if, he'd come home safe. Supporting the dream sometimes meant carrying the consequences alone. And children notice more than adults think. They feel absence. They hear stress. They grow up understanding sacrifice before understanding choice. The realization hit hard. Success meant nothing if it cost the people it was meant to support. Redefining what strength really means. The quiet period after burnout changed Rick. He didn't lose his drive, but he gained perspective. Strength wasn't about working until collapse. Leadership wasn't about doing everything alone. Sustainability wasn't weakness, it was responsibility. Murphy's Diesel didn't abandon its values. Instead, it refined them. More structure. Better boundaries. Shared responsibility. Teaching the next generation that helping others also means protecting yourself. The videos returned, not louder, not flashier, but more intentional. They showed not just recoveries, but lessons. Not just machines, but moments of reflection. And audiences noticed. Because maybe the real reason people connect with Wrecker Rick isn't the horsepower or the danger, it's the honesty. The question that lingers. Today, Murphy's Diesel stands as proof that compassion can coexist with success, but not without cost, recalibration, and hard truths. Rick's story isn't about perfection. It's about persistence, mistakes, and learning when to slow down before everything breaks. And it leaves us with one final question, one that lingers long after the engines shut off. What does success actually mean if it costs you everything else? Maybe the real victory isn't the recovery caught on camera. Maybe it's knowing when to stop pushing and choosing to stay present for the people who helped you survive the climb. Rick Murphy had a way of learning by breaking things. It wasn't a philosophy he read in books or a lesson he learned in school. It was the only method that had ever worked for him. He grew up in a town where summers smelled like diesel and winter mornings were measured by the number of minutes it took for the heater to warm the shop. His father taught him to drive a dolly before he taught him to drive a car. He learned to listen to a motor the way other kids learned to listen to music, the cadence of a misfire, the way a pump whined before it failed, the small, telltale twinge that announced a bearing about to give up. That ear kept him alive in ways more than one. When Rick took over the family's tiny recovery outfit in his 20s, the work was simple and brutal. Stuck cars, overturned pickups, the inevitable calls from drivers who had miscalculated winter turns. He could fix things, and he could pull people out of situations most townsfolk considered hopeless. It was honest work, and it fed a stubborn sense of pride, the kind you carry into the trailer at night after a 12-hour shift and sleep with in your clothes. He tried to include his family in the journey. Sometimes the kids, a blur of scraped knees and loud questions, came along on runs, sleeping in the truck cab between calls. Sometimes school events were rearranged around job schedules. Maya took up second-shift admin duties and learned the cadence of dispatch calls the way Rick had learned the cadence of motors. But emergencies don't care about calendars. There were missed birthdays and school plays because a tow was hours away in a canyon during a storm. There were nights when the smell of diesel followed him to the dinner table and he could not shake the image of a rusted frame crumpled in the snow. Over time the business grew not because Rick chased brand deals or marketing plans, but because people outside their small town began to notice a pattern: shared sacrifice. The Murphy family learned to live with unpredictability. It rewired their calendar, their expectations, and sometimes their patience. Maya learned to ask fewer questions when a call came in at midnight and learned, instead, to leave a thermos of coffee on the counter where Rick could reach it when he came home. The kids learned to cheer from the sideline when a recovery that looked impossible turned out to be possible after all. They understood, without being told, that some doors opened not because someone knocked politely, but because someone kept hammering when others walked away. And then Hellboy happened. It began with a series of annoyances that piled into a conviction. Rick had purchased a high-mileage Ram 5500 to do heavy recoveries. That truck had a habit of destroying transfer cases under the stress of real work. It was infuriating, a handful of miles, a day in the canyon, and then another broken part that kept them from getting back to the next job. His crew mocked him for sticking with it. Critics outside the shop, an armchair chorus of advice and skepticism, said the platform was a poor choice for heavy towing. But Rick saw something they didn't: the potential in a machine designed differently. What if the problem wasn't the repairs, he wondered, but the design itself? It was a dangerous question because once you asked it, staying small was no longer an option. Fixing parts one by one was like applying bandages to a bridge that needed a rebuild. So he chose to rebuild. The goal sounded insane. Build the world's largest off-road wrecker. Make a truck that could go where traditional wreckers could not, and do so with enough strength to haul vehicles out of places people had long since given up on. Hellboy, so named as a joke among the crew because of its stubborn, volcanic bulk and the bright primer they used early on, was not just a cosmetic overhaul. It was an act of surgical reinvention. Rick gutted the driveline and started with the kind of modifications other shops only dared dream about. Compound turbos. A massive stroker pump. Extreme injectors. Reinforced frame rails of thick, welded steel that took the corners of the chassis and turned them into something closer to an exoskeleton. Every component that had been a weak link in the Ram's line was rethought and rebuilt. The question of scale introduced another problem: mobility. How do you make a behemoth navigate narrow mountain trails threaded with switchbacks and fallen trees? The answer was radical: four-wheel steering. Not the polite, incremental kind, but extreme articulation that let Hellboy pivot in places a normal truck could not even imagine. People called it unnecessary. They called it showmanship. They called it eccentricity. Rick called it the only way. It worked. Hellboy could slip between boulders, crab across slick ledges, and orient its nose to a jammed vehicle at angles that made conventional wreckers useless. Tests in sand, snow, mud, and rock transformed the machine from a curiosity into a solution. Rick started filming the work not because he wanted fame, but because he wanted proof. The footage was raw: nights under halogen lamps where his hands were tattooed in grease, the sound of metal protesting in the dark, pieces breaking and being welded back together in improvised ways. He uploaded everything, not glamorized highlight reels, but long, stubborn sequences of trial and error. He filmed the young apprentice who learned to read blueprints as if they were stories, the mechanic who cursed softly and then laughed when a problem yielded, the way Maya held a wrench when a hand was needed. Viewers tuned in to see something authentic, not the polished end product, but the sweat and missteps that made the end product possible. The paradox revealed itself quickly. Why did failure feel more magnetic than perfection? Maybe because failure showed the blueprint of determination. Maybe because people wanted to see how other people reacted when things went wrong. The channel exploded, and with it came a new set of questions. Could viral attention be a currency strong enough to build a real business? Could an audience convert into customers who trusted the machine and the man who built it? The answer came from the road. Viewers began shipping vehicles across state lines. They asked Rick to pull trucks out of ravines their local services couldn't reach. YouTube became proof, vivid, searchable proof of capability and accountability. But virality masked a different story. Months where the supply chain failed them, a redesign that forced them to scrap entire subsystems, parts that were months out of stock, and a cycle of public scrutiny that was sometimes cruel. Critics argued Hellboy was too heavy, too wide, too fantastical for real-world work. There were legal questions, engineering headaches, and insurance math that made accountants wince. Rick slept in the trailer more nights than not for vanity but to keep the overhead down and the work moving. The real tests didn't happen in upload statistics. They happened on trailheads at dawn when a call came in for a truck pinned on a shelf of ice or a vehicle swallowed in a wash of mud. Hellboy performed in places where smaller wreckers got stuck or turned back. Each successful recovery became a lesson and an advertisement at once, a living proof that the design, the gamble, and the public stumbles had been worth the cost. But the machine did something else besides rescue vehicles. It transformed the way Rick saw himself and the business. Hellboy became a symbol, not of ego, but of persistence and empathy. When Rick accepted a job that paid less than it cost, it wasn't charity alone. It was an investment in reputation, community, and in the idea that sometimes the right thing to do doesn't track neatly on a ledger. He gave away work when money ran thin, knowing that goodwill and proof of competence would return in other forms. And yet that generosity took its toll. Maya picked up extra shifts. The kids learned to cook simple meals. There were times Rick questioned whether the price was worth it. On long, solitary drives back from a job, he would listen to the trucks hum and think about the alternatives. What if he'd taken a less risky path? Steady growth, predictable contracts, evenings at home. But another question lived there, louder. What would he be if he quit at the first real failure? Hellboy's public failures mattered as much as its successes. When a pulley sheared in the middle of a live-streamed test, viewers watched the team scramble, retool, and laugh through the frustration. That vulnerability, paradoxically, bred trust. People began to ask themselves, and Rick, difficult questions. Are you willing to risk reputation to solve a real problem? What do you teach your children when you model persistence in public? Those questions resonated with a growing audience of people who recognized the cost of dreams. They saw something true in a family that lived, literally and figuratively, on the edge of the garage. The channel's comment section filled with messages from other small business owners, single parents juggling second jobs, and mechanics who had once chosen certainty but now wondered whether their own quiet refusals to quit were meaningful. When Hellboy hauled a rusted pickup out of a desert wash or slid a semi from a slick mountain shoulder, the moment became more than a job. It became a chapter in a larger story about what it means to commit. The machine became a mirror. People saw themselves in its dents and repairs and in Rick's stubborn patience. And the final lesson, the quiet one no one framed in promotional copy, was about cost. So the final question isn't about trophies or followers. Is success about winning, or about refusing to quit when losing feels inevitable? How much of our identity is tied to the public narrative of success, and how much is bound to those who pick up the tools when we fall? Wrecker Rick's story suggests that real success isn't built on strength alone. It's built on risk, on empathy, and on the willingness to fail in public while trying to make something meaningful. It's built on the nights you sacrifice for the day that finally arrives, and on the people who stand beside you when everything is uncertain. At the end of a long week, Rick sits on the trailer's back step and watches the sun hit Hellboy's primer. The chrome glints. The welds hold. Maya brings a thermos and sets it beside him without a word. The kids argue about whose turn it is to help clean tools. No one is celebrating the algorithm's numbers or the latest shout-out on a forum. They are quiet, bruised, and oddly content. They have kept the machine alive and, in doing so, kept something more alive. An agreement between people to keep trying together. What, then, do we measure when we measure success? Followers? Recovery totals? Or the simple knowledge that when another person calls from the side of the road, there's a team willing to go where others won't? Which is the real victory, the one counted in likes, or the one counted in lives not lost because someone refused to turn away?